The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Wait for a few more people to show up. Okay, Alessandra, you think get started? Smaller crowd this morning, but let's get going. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar session today. My name is Shelly James. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Exciting. Today, we're going to talk about Harden RFC interfaces. Our presenter today is Alessandro Banzer, our SAP Security and GRC expert here at Exciting. A couple of things to mention before we get started. This is one of several new webinars that we have scheduled this year. We have one more scheduled for May, and we have a few others in the works that we will be announcing fairly soon. There's a slide deck at the end of this presentation where you can see the upcoming session with a link to our webpage and where you can see updates as they occur. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, you can use the questions panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. Just type in your questions. We'll keep an eye on them. And at the end of Alessandro's presentation, we'll try to answer those questions. This webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a link from the recording from the GoToWebinar. Later, you'll receive an email from our marketing team to follow up to make sure you got all of your questions answered. And if you have any additional ones, please send them back to the marketing email or to me at sjames@exciting.com, and we can help answer them offline. Now that we have those items covered, I'm going to hand things over to Alessandro, and he's going to walk you through today's session.
Perfect. Thank you, Shelley. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about RFC, very interesting topic, how we can, harden RFC interfaces, how can we redesign them. Just from an agenda perspective, a few words about Exciting for those of you that don't know us yet. I'll give you a quick introduction into what RFCs, what they are, what they mean, and also one of the things that very often goes along with RFC, which is called Uconn, Unified Connectivity. Just a quick introduction to get a general understanding. What is RFC? What is Uconn? What does it do? What doesn't it do? So that we can then, tackle the more challenging questions around RFCs. How do we redesign them? How do we harden RFC interfaces? Following like a least privilege principle. We look into different tools that we can use for that are recommended by SAP, and we just walk through a couple of steps that you guys should consider when you tackle RFC interfaces. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, if I'm too fast or you need any further explanations, as Shelley already mentioned, just type it into the questions panel, and I'll try to answer them either throughout the webinar if I see them pop in, or then at the end. With that, just a few words about Exciting. Who are we? Been around for over a decade already. I've been founded back in 2008 in Switzerland. That's also my accent, as you can tell. I'm from Liechtenstein, not from Switzerland, but very close. So I have more like a Swiss type accent. I've been here in the US since 2016. I'm, as Shelley is, based in Tampa, Florida, or in the Tampa Bay area in Florida. And we have offices throughout Europe and, as I mentioned, also here in the United States. We are an SAP Gold Partner. We have different certifications. We have all our solutions are SAP certified for S/4HANA and also other versions, obviously. We have different recognized expertise certifications in different areas, like, for example, governance, risk, compliance for the GRC part, but also data privacy and many more. We are over 100 employees strong. We have a very close relationship with SAP. As I mentioned, we're a Gold Partner, but we're also an education partner. So basically, if you visit SAP trainings from SAP, it's very likely you're going to talk to one of our employees that is delivering a training for SAP. So very close relationship from that perspective. Yeah, I think that's enough about us. Let's just jump into the topic. Let's talk about RFCs. That's why we're all here. That's, I think, what you guys are most interested in. RFCs, what is RFCs? Remote function calls. I think we're all aware of that. So basically, a connection from one system to another. Interfaces and connections come in different flavors. Standard in the standard ABAP world, very often the communication is RFC. When we go into the cloud, there's different communication protocols that are being used, whether it's like OData or different means of communication. But at the end of the day, when we talk about RFCs or technical users, it's a technical connectivity between one system to another. Here I just, not a very nice, a little bit an ugly slide, but I think you guys, see what I want to mention here. A lot of customers, or pretty much every customer, has more than one system. We have our core ERP, but it's a ECC or an S/4HANA, where we store different information. And then we have different systems connected to the S/4HANA, for example, to our ERP, whether it's a central user administration to administer user master data, might be a GRC tool to run risk analysis, provisioning workflows. We might have SAP IDM for that as well. But then we also have other systems that utilize, for example, the business partner information that we have in the system, like customer master data, vendor master data, cost center information, employee information, and so on. And data, is being exchanged from left to right, from bottom to the top, and it's all happening in a technical or through a technical interface. So a lot of data is being exchanged. That means there is data flow. That also means there are certain authorizations that are required. Now, in today's world, we're not just talking ABAP based, and I have it here with SuccessFactors and Ariba, just to mention two. There's obviously many others, whether it's Analytics Cloud, Fieldglass, and so on. But now also have to add to that entire mix of systems we have in our landscape, also a lot of cloud applications, where we also exchange data back and forth, where we do certain process steps, and so on. So it's an ever-growing landscape. It's going hybrid now. We have cloud applications that are extending on-premise applications, and we really have to be very careful. How do we handle the authorizations and the security of those interfaces? That's very, very important. Now, from the slide before, we saw we have different connectivity here. I just took one. If you have a connection, for example, from our S/4HANA into our CUA, central user administration, to, in a simple means, administrate user master data. We're all aware that in S/4HANA is what we mentioned. We're in S/4HANA, but in S/4HANA we have different. In the entire S/4HANA landscape, we have different system levels. Like we have a development environment, we have a quality environment, we have productive environment. We might even have sandboxes. We might have pre-production, different system. And then also within those systems, we have different clients. We have a client 000, which is more for basis to administrate the system. But then we have our golden client, might be 001 or might be 100, whatever your client is. And we have also early watch clients, that are used from a basis system monitoring perspective. So there's various clients. A lot of customers have more than just one golden client. We have client 100, client 200, client 300, and so on. So depending on the customer, there's a lot of different clients, even within one system. And that means every client, every system has connectivity. For example, here in the CUA example, we have CUA connected to the dev environment for all the 3 clients. We have it also connected to prod into 2 clients, maybe connected to a sandbox, maybe to quality, and so on. So there's a lot of different connections that have to be there so that we can exchange data back and forth. And all those connections pose a significant risk if we don't have them under control. So if we have them over authorized, if we don't do any security to those connections, those connections can be misused, and at the end of the day pose a risk to our overall security. And the reason for that very often is we're doing everything we can to protect our golden client in production. So let's say the client 100 here in my S/4HANA prod, this is the most important client we have. That's where we all, our business data, our business processes, everything runs on that golden client. Now the problem is, if I don't protect my dev, if I don't protect my sandbox, and I have here RFC connections, and here in sandbox I don't care about authorizations. I don't care about authorizations in the RFC. So if everything here runs on SAP All, in the worst case, if someone gets access here, they can utilize the RFC to get into CUA, and then from CUA they can utilize the next connection to get into prod, for example. So that's very important. So as soon as we connect and interconnect systems with one another, then all those systems poses a risk that one might misuse that connectivity from one system to the other. That's why it's so important that we talk about RFC hardening and properly authorize every type of interface there is between systems. That's very important. This is kind of always the challenge a lot of customers have. And here you can see, you might not have all the systems I mentioned before. You might only have a few, but then you have different clients. You have dev, quality, prod. There's a lot of interfaces that are potentially available that need to be under control. When we talk about especially RFCs, not sure how familiar you all are with the RFC, but I just want to do a quick polling question here to for you guys to guess how many remote enabled function modules do you guys think exist in the latest or in S/4HANA 2021 release. The remote enabled function modules are the ones that can be called from outside the system. That means, if I'm in CUA and I call a function module in that exists, the code is in S/4HANA, I can call it from outside the system and execute the code or that program within the S/4HANA box. How many do you think there are? So I see here, let's give it another like 5 seconds. So I see we have a favorite here. Okay, so let's see. So we close the polling question. All right, so I can see that almost 70% of you guys say it's 48,000. A few said there's even more than 73,000. So let's take a look. So when we think about just also the evolution a little bit, in SAP NetViewer, which is the foundation, there is a little bit over 16,000 remote enabled function modules available that can be called from outside the system. In total, there's more function modules, obviously. Not all of them are remote enabled. Some can just be called within the system, so not from outside. That's just the foundation NetViewer stack. If you then add on, we look into ERP, I think it was enhancement pack 7, I pulled the data from. We had a little bit over 45,000 that were remote enabled. We can already see just the function modules itself, there's more than 500,000 available. So a lot of programs that are in the system and in S/4HANA, and as the majority of you guys voted correctly, there's more than 48,000 available that are remote enabled in S/4HANA 2021. That means if we have an RFC interface running on SAP All, that interface can execute every single one of that 48,000 function modules. And that's one thing we have to be aware of. So there's a lot of things that we can do. A lot of function modules, and especially remote enabled ones, we need them, so systems can function for communication purposes, but also for data exchange and different processes. but obviously we don't want to have all of them available for all the interfaces. That's why we have to talk about, redesigning and hardening the RFCs. So very interesting number, just to be aware of that. Now, when we talk about RFC security, very often we talk about, or when we read blogs or listen to SAP, there's also one thing that always comes up, and that's called Uconn, or Unified Connectivity. Uconn is basically an SAP standard tool that's available. It was released with NetView 740. So if you're on a current SP and kernel patch level, it will be available to you. It's license free. There's no license cost you have to pay. It's just available. And what Uconn basically is, it's basically a firewall that allows you to classify remote enabled function modules, either in a whitelist or in a blacklist approach, where you can either say certain function modules are allowed or the others are not, or you say I'm blacklisting, I'm disallowing the ones we don't want to have enabled for remote use. Uconn is not enabled by default. So you have to actively enable, and you have to decide which way you take, whether you go the whitelisting or the blacklisting approach. And what's very important with Uconn, this is very often where it gets a little bit confusing. Uconn does not replace authorizations; it only complements it, because Uconn is a firewall. So we can say a function module is blocked or it's enabled. That's one or the other. If it's enabled for every user that has the authorizations to use it. If you block it, it's blocked for everyone. So it doesn't replace authorizations, it can only complement. And that ultimately means, there's no protection for individual users. So, if we say certain function modules are enabled, they're enabled for everyone that has the authorizations to use them. Also, we have to do it in every single client on every single system. So, to really have or really be efficient with using Uconn, it needs to be enabled in the entire landscape, in all the clients, in all the systems. That's very important to remember. And here, just a little bit more to kind of again, what I just said. So if you think about back to our S4HANA 2021 release, where we have more than 48,000 remote enabled function modules. If we're going to enable Uconn, whether we do the blacklisting or the whitelisting approach, we have to enable or disable them. And that means we have to classify all 48,000 remote enabled function modules. There are trace information we can take from the system to see what's being used, but at the end of the day, we still have to classify all the ones that we either want to blacklist or all the ones we want to whitelist. So, and again, it's either or, and it's not based on user. And how then, if we have it enabled in either scenario, how does it work? Let's say there's a system, a connection interface that requires or that calls a function module that's remote enabled. What happens then is the call comes into the system. Uconn is active, so it means Uconn will check first. If Uconn says you cannot use it because it's for example blacklisted, that one cannot be used, or it's not on the whitelist, then Uconn basically refuses that connection. The user cannot use that function module. If it's whitelisted or it's not on the blacklist, then Uconn will allow the function call, and then the authorization check will happen in the same way as it always does when we have Uconn, for example, deactivated. It will just be the authorizations, and then here, it will check for SRFC and everything else. And if we have the authorizations, then we get access to the function module. If not, then obviously we get the error message or the return code that we are not authorized to use it. So what that ultimately means is, as I mentioned before, Uconn complements the authorization concept, but it doesn't replace it. If we have the authorization concept under control, so if we have a least privilege approach to authorizations and our RFCs are not authorized, then I would almost say Uconn is kind of obsolete. There's not a huge value added to it if you have the authorizations under control. Certainly there's a little bit, because it's still a firewall, so it still blocks a lot of things in case we have the authorizations not under control. Then obviously Uconn would add a little bit of value. But if we truly have a very strict authorization concept and we very much have that under control, then the authorization is really what we have to do. regardless, if you go with Uconn and you don't do authorizations, you will still be opening up your system for misuse, because there's a lot of things that you need for the day-to-day operation of the SAP system. For example, if you use a CUA, CUA needs to create users, needs to assign roles, needs to do certain user master changes. So those remote function-enabled function models are available. You have to whitelist them in Uconn, or they have to enable them so they can be used. But you still want to make sure not every user can use it. Not every interface can use it. So again, the authorizations really is what you have to have under control. I hope that makes sense. Just a quick one into Uconn to have a general understanding what Uconn means. When we talk about RFCs, and I also see we have a lot of people joining from Europe. Obviously, RFCs is also a little bit has a lot to do with compliance. At the end of the day, a lot of things are, and when we talk about security, is IT security or compliance related. But it's very important if you have to follow GDPR, and I truly believe everyone should, whether by law or not. I think data protection laws are very important, that we protect the data. So what's very important is when it comes to GDPR, we also have to make sure that the RFCs, that the connectivity and the data exchange between systems is under control. That means we know what data is being exchanged, and also want to make sure it's properly protected. That ultimately means, and we all know in SAP there's a vast amount of data, customer master data, vendor master data, employee master data. If I just think about if you have success factors or SAP HR, there's a lot of information about our people that I think data that needs to be protected, but it's first, last name, date of birth, social security, addresses, my health history, and so on. A lot of the companies, they store a lot of data, and that's all data I personally don't want to be publicly available. I want to make sure my data is properly protected. That's why I say data protection laws are very important. And that also, it's not just true for end users that can access data, it's also for systems. If we have a connection to, I don't know, to a CRM, I don't think, in CRM, they need to know my social security number. That's not relevant for any process in CRM. So there's no need that data would even be available to be exchanged. And that ultimately comes back to the authorizations. We don't want to over authorize. We just want to authorize what is needed, following least privilege principle approaches, so that only that is being available that is truly needed for that business process. And at the end of the day, if you're GDPR and you have to be GDPR compliant, what's very important is, first of all, you have to protect personal information, but you also have to document. And the better your authorization concept, the better your authorization design, the better you can also document the interfaces to truly understand, what data is being exchanged. And we'll see an example here in just a little bit as well on a slide. I have a screenshot about that, how we could potentially report on that as well. So when we talk RFCs, when we talk about RFC hardening, what do we have to do? What are the things that we have to be aware of? First and foremost, what's very important is very often we do, we as exciting if we do RFC cleanup projects, every customer has custom code, custom function modules that are being used for data exchange and so on. What's very important is that the custom code is a black box for everyone that doesn't know the code. So that's something that's just very truly custom to you. So it's very important that any vulnerability in custom code needs to be detected. That ultimately means we have to do code scanning to see what does the custom code do. Does it have access to sensitive data? Does it pull sensitive data? Does it update sensitive data? And so on. That's one thing that always needs to happen, because custom code, again, is a black box for every implementer, every partner use. We don't know your code. So it's important that we always tackle that as well. So don't forget about custom code. The second most important thing is, when it comes to roles and authorizations, as I mentioned, least privilege principle, but also documentation for documentation purposes, to have very use lists to see what is used by what. We want to make sure that all the roles and authorizations are built in SAP standard. I'll show an example here, what I mean in just a little bit, what I mean with SAP standard. What do I mean with building the roles the right way so we can document roles, so that we can make sure the role concepts not just for our end users, but also for the RFCs, are sustainable, are maintainable in the long run, and that we always have, you know, a proper transparency to see and to document what is it that the roles do, what is it that the roles authorize the end users at the end of the day. Documentation is a big topic. Again, that's one real thing, especially when you have to follow GDPR. You know, it needs to be properly documented. All that's so much easier if you're following a lot of the standard approaches that SAP has to offer. When we have when we redesign RFC interfaces, so let's say you run on SAP All or on very extensive access, just so that everything works, and you want to redesign and harden that, obviously we're taking a lot of access away. What that means is, if we take SAP All away and we assign new roles to an interface, we want to make sure that the interface doesn't go down, because that would be the worst thing that can happen if an interface goes down. That ultimately means we're interrupting the business process. Now, what's a little bit tricky with RFCs is not all the RFCs exist everywhere. So let's say I have a connection to a bank. I don't have a connection to the bank in my development system where I can play around and test. The connection is only in production, and that's where, you know, the connection is being used. So certain things cannot be tested in development or in a quality system simply because it's not available and it's just not there. So validating and testing new role designs, you know, especially when you run SAP All, can be a little bit tricky. So there are solutions to it. Don't be afraid. There's solutions to it, so we can test roles risk-free without impacting anything. Also in production, that's all possible. And then obviously also the continuity of the you know, security strategy. So we want to make sure that, you know, once we have the RFCs hardened, once we have everything under control, that going forward we don't deteriorate from that. So we want to make sure we properly document, we have all the means put in place, that that concept that we put in place can also be maintained going forward. That's very, very important. Now we'll see what that also means. So let's take a look. So as I already said, the challenges are I think kind of what I have here is pretty much, I said it already, but just to rephrase it maybe. And that's, I think, the challenges that most of you face. Very often RFC interfaces are totally over authorized. I just mentioned here SAP All. I would say 9 out of 10 customers, they use RFCs on SAP All or SAP All-like authorizations. And that's very risky. I think that's why we're all here. We want to learn what can we do to get it under control. Manually reauthorizing RFCs is also very time consuming. It's risky, it's cumbersome. It's just very hard to tackle such projects if we have no guidelines or guidance on how can we do it. As I mentioned, test environments and certain you know, interfaces, they don't exist in development. We cannot test it, so they're just there. Whether it's, you know, web services I mentioned too, for example, a bank, or, you know, connections into Ariba or success factors. Very often we only have one success factors. There's no development version of success factors. We just have one version, and that connection works. Or maybe we have, but we don't have it connected. So there's always that risk that something doesn't exist in development, so we cannot properly test. And then also, development doesn't necessarily reflect what we have in production. Even if we have a connection, you know, certain processes we just don't run in development. When it comes to building solid authorizations, and you heard us probably if you attended previous webinars, we talked a lot about transaction SV24, the authorization proposal database. So the default values that we can maintain for transaction codes, for function modules, and for any other menu objects you can add to a role, whether it's, you know, Fiori, backend services, and so on. Unfortunately, when it comes to function modules, the SV24 values are very poorly maintained, if at all. So a lot of function modules, there's no default values available from SAP. That's a little bit on SAP. They didn't do a great job there. So that means very often when it comes to RFCs, we're not utilizing the means of S24, the means of PFCG to properly build roles the way we should build them, or maybe the way we build them for end user authorizations. Simply because there's no proposal values, there's no real mean to then, you know, use the right way to do it, because it doesn't add a lot of values. Now the good the answer to that is SAP didn't do a good job, but we still can do it. There's still a lot of means how we can optimize that to get all the good values and the good means of PFCG, of SAP24, also for authorization for technical users. All in all, I think that's all the things that I mentioned. That's very often why customers just say, let's just use sub all or a sub all like role, because it just works. We don't want to interfere with our business processes. So never touch a running system. So just as long as it works, we let it work. The good thing is there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of time-consuming tasks that come with RFCs. But the good thing is there are solutions. So let's talk a little bit more about the solutions. The solution I'm going to talk today, is one of our tools that is in use by SAP, that also SAP recommends in a subnote to be used. It's obviously a third-party tool, but it's the tool available. It's the only third-party tool that SAP recommends in a subnote to be used. And it's also a tool that SAP Consulting uses if they do RFC cleanups. The reason for that is just everything I just mentioned, all that can be under control if we use a tool. So let's see what this means. So the tool reference, and you might have seen it on our homepage or in previous webinars, is the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite, or short XMS. So whenever I talk about XMS, that's a suite of tools. It has 7 modules that do different things from code scanning, from maintaining roles, designing roles, testing roles, documenting roles, security monitoring. All that is part of the XMS. The XMS is a huge tool. It's been around for 14 years and does a lot of things. We have 1,000 use cases in there. So today we'll just talk one particular one, which is the RFC. So let's see what we always do. And obviously what I show here, the screenshots that I show here are from our tools. If you don't have the tool, come and talk to us. If you don't want to have a tool, you just want to do it manually, then I think the approach I'm showing here, you can also do it in a very manual approach through SAP standard tools. It will just be very manual, will be very time consuming, and certain things obviously are not available. But I think the approach when you do RFC cleanups should always be the same. So the very first thing that we always do is we scan code. As I mentioned, custom codes are a black box, so we don't know what's in there. What we can do with our code scanner as part of the XMS, we can scan any type of code, whether it's SAP standard code, custom code, partner code. We can follow the entire call stack and follow the code all the way to the end. Why do we do that? We do it for 2 reasons. First of all, we want to detect any vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities can be something that is just wrong from a coding perspective, where something is not handled correctly. Let's say you check for authorizations, but you don't do anything with the return code. So whether the user is authorized or not, you just don't care. You check, but you don't do anything with it. That could be an issue within the code. But we also look for authorization checks, and in more particular, also the ones that are not available. So if you pull any, let's say you pull master data in your custom code, you read from table MARA, you read from table KNA1 for customer master, whatever you do, if the data that you're reading or updating or whatever you do with that data, if that data is not protected with an authorization check, then our tool will report that. So if you pull data from KNA1 and you're not protecting it, the tool will tell you, hey, you're pulling data or you're reading data from table KNA1. Table KNA1 should be protected with a certain authorization object and the activity and so on. So we're really on that data level. We can tell you what is it that you're missing from a security perspective that should be there in your custom code. If it is there, then like here, we'll see it. So here I just scanned an SAP standard function module. So we can see what authorization objects, field and values are being checked, when you execute that function module. And then we can compare that with SAP24. So basically what we see here, we see whether the object, field and values maintained in SAP24. And if it's not, we can directly update from here. So it finds the authorization checks that are there, or the ones that are not there, then it will report them so we can implement them. But we can also add that information to SU24 to optimize SU24, so that when I add that function module to my role, all those objects and fields and values that are defined, that are maintained as SU24, will be proposed into the authorization profile of the role. That makes role building further down the road way, way, way easier. So that's always the first thing we do, is go and scan code. And for that, obviously, we have a tool. We don't want to do that manually. If you use the source code report that is available, you check one object after another. It takes you forever. We do it in mass. The second thing we always do is optimizing SU24. As I mentioned, SU24, that's the backbone of PFCG. It's the backbone of the authorization concept. We need to have proper SU24 proposals when we start building the roles, because only then we get to a solid, sustainable, maintainable authorization design that also can be documented, and that's also proven to be working in the future. So we have different reports, and you can see them here. We have a lot of different SU24 optimization reports for RFCs, for different type of programs, different type of transactions, and so on, that ultimately allows us to scan for whatever we want to scan. Here we scan for function modules, and we can then see, here in the simplest form, these are the function modules that are available, and we can see whether the SRFC is proposed with the function group or the function name. And we can see, if it's okay, if everything's correct, if something is missing or wrong. All that can be checked, because the system rules we can scan it for. We go through it, and if we then want to update, we just update it directly from here. Just double click, it's updated. We can also do in mass. This really allows us to really optimize SU24 so that we get all the information that we possibly can already proposed from the section SU24, so we don't have to do it manually. That's always the first step, is getting SU24 under control. When we have SU24 under control, then we start role building. And here I just have an animated screen of our what we call the role designer. So what we then do, we can use usage information, trace information, as we can see here on the left-hand side, where I have the usage, where the mouse is now moving. So I can, read usage from my RFC users, for example, here for GRC. I can see what that interface used based on usage, based on the trace, and then directly here in the screen, I can create new roles. So we can see it here. I just built a new role for my GRC backend. I can see what's all in there, and I can also assign it to my RFC user to simulate that. I can do certain type of documentation, for example, here I call it GRC backend role for RFC user. I document the role, and then I can drag and drop it also over to the right to my user to assign it to my GRC RFC, and then I can see that the user turned green. It's 100% covered. So that basically means that if I build that role the way I have it from the trace, the user will be 100% covered based on what the user was doing in the past. So what we do when it comes to the role design, and this is just an approach that over the years worked very well, and now it just starts over, so there's nothing as I was just showing. What we have seen over the years is what works very well with RFCs is we build scenario roles, and then we build user roles. A scenario role would be something like, for example, for solution manager, for IDM, for CUA, for GRC, where in every system it's the same solution. Like, if I have a solution manager backend, every child system that's connected to the solution manager, at the end of the day requires the same roles, whether it's in S/4HANA, whether it's in ERP, whether it's in CRM or SRM or in any other system. It's always the same authorizations solution manager backend needs. So that's why we call it a solution role. A user role, on the other hand, would be something very specific. So if I have, let's say I have a connection to Ariba, that's only from one system to the other, and it's just for one specific scenario, then we will build it more like a user-based role. But usually the two types that we differentiate, where the user-based role is usually for one system, for one user, and the other one would be for multiple systems, same type of user, but in different systems. That's always what we do. We obviously use our role designer that you can see here is more like drag and drop that allows us to build roles from the menu perspective. And then once you're happy, we can push it over to PFCG. So it's a true PFCG role. What we can also do, and here just on the next screenshot, what we can also do as part of our role designer, we have a lot of reports that come with it that allows us to scan and analyze those type of roles. So even before I build a role in PFCG, so if I just build a role in the role designer, which is a virtual cockpit where we can do that drag and drop and do different things and simulate assignments, and all that is virtual. It's all just simulation data. Already at that point where I don't even have a role in PFCG, I can scan it against GRC. If we have access control, for example, I can use our internal rule set to scan for certain, let's say for critical combinations of critical authorizations. What we have, especially when we talk about GDPR, and here I have just an example where I basically scanned for GDPR authorizations, and then I can see that role. Looks like I must have messed up here the screenshot. That role here has, for example, access to customer master data. So if I would build that role, again, it's not built yet, but we're just analyzing. That role is not built yet, but based on what I put into the role, it would basically allow the user, or would give the user access to customer master data. Why is that? It would basically go down to the authorization object, based on S24 proposals, what would be in that role that would ultimately lead the role to be accessing customer master or customer data. So already at that point, I can scan for SODs, critical authorizations, GDPR related access, different types of access before I even build a single role in PFCG. Once we're happy and we have everything is, let's say, validated from that perspective, I push a button and the role is being created in PFCG. When the role is created in PFCG, obviously what happens here, and here I'm just showing the Solman backend monitoring role, the role menu will be built, or the role will be built through the role menu. So that means all the function modules, as we can see here, will be added to the role menu. Why do we do that? We do that so that SC24 can propose the authorizations into the authorization profile. The same way as we do it for transaction codes, we'll also do it for RFC function modules, or for web services, for web dympros, for backend services, and so on. It's always the same approach. We want to build the roles through the role menu. So the role menu looks like that, so we know exactly what functions are in there, or what applications are in there. And then if we go into the authorizations, so if I go into the authorizations, look at the authorizations, I can see everything I have in there will either be standard or maintained. We don't want to have anything manually inserted or changed, because we want to make sure it's coming from SC24 and we have it properly maintained. Why is that so important? For a few reasons. If you ever have to change the role, let's say you have to remove an application because the scenario changes, you remove, maybe you're changing the landscape, whatever you do, and you want to remove access from a role because it's not needed anymore. If you remove the application, let's say the function module from the role, you also want to make sure that the authorizations go out. So you don't want to have orphaned authorizations in your authorization data, because that ultimately would lead to over authorizations that the interface doesn't need. So that's very important. If we build the roles through the menu and we set it before, then if we do any changes to the menu and I remove, for example, something, the authorizations will also go out. The other benefit of using the menu in SC24 is documentation purposes and the sustainability and the maintainability of the authorizations. I see that in the next screenshot. So if you look into the authorizations and we click on the where used list, and here's just the old screen from PFCG. So if you have the new ALV grid, it looks a little different, but the same information. If you click on the where used list, like that mountain with the sun symbol here, if you click on that, then you can see, if you want to understand, why are certain authorizations in the role, you can click on the where used list and it will show you which application brings in which authorizations. And then here you can see that application, which is a function module, brings in the here I'm for SRFC, not the best example, but you can see SRFC with activity 16 for that RFC name with RFC type star comes from that application. And that's something you can go down on every authorization object. So if there's access to the customer master and you want to understand why is there access to customer master, you identify the authorization object, you click on the very used list, and then you can see, oh, application so-and-so brings in that authorization, that means it needs it. So you have that very used list. And so from a documentation perspective, now if you have the document, for example, under GDPR, you have the document, which RFC users have access to customer master data or vendor master data. You can run a risk analysis, for example, from GRC, from access control, or from our tool. Then you find the role, you find the user, and you can also find the application, whether it's a web service or function module that's needing that authorization. And then you can always see, or you can explain and document why certain roles have access to customer master. That's why this is so important. So a lot of good things happen if you use SC24 from a documentation perspective, which ultimately goes into transparency. The authorization design is very transparent. You can go back, you can use the very used list to understand why certain authorizations are in the role. And also then obviously from a maintainability perspective, if you build them the right way and you have to upgrade, and we always have to upgrade our systems. There's always a next release, a next version. If you use that approach, the easier those migrations will be, because we can then go back to SC24, make the required changes, and then push them back into the roles and have the roles updated. And it is transparent and it can be maintained in the long run. That's why we want to use that. When we have the roles built, one thing that's still that needs to happen is testing the roles. Now, as I mentioned, certain connections are only available in production, so certain things must be tested, let's say, quote unquote, tested in production. And what we use there is an approach that we call the productive test simulation, or PTS. The PTS works in a way that we leverage the SAP standard reference user. And we basically assign, through our tools, we assign a reference user to a technical user, as shown here. So our technical user, our interface, for example, to SuccessFactors from S/4HANA to CUA or wherever it is, runs on SAP All today. So today it's running on SAP All, everything is working, no issues. Now we build new roles. The approach we just showed, or you do it manually, however you do it, we still have to test it. Now what we use is the capability of the reference user. And what the reference user does, it basically extends the authorizations of the technical user. Now the technical user, again, runs on SAP All. We're not touching that. We're just extending through the reference user the user buffer of that technical user, and that reference user comes with those newly created roles. So these are the new roles we designed, we created, we maintained based on traces. We try to do it as best as we can, but they might not be 100% functional. There might still be missing authorizations that we don't know today that we're trying to find out. And we want to find it out directly in production. And we want to find it out without impacting or negatively impacting the interface. And that's why we use the reference user. And why do we do that? For one reason. If there's a reference user assigned to another user, whether it's a technical user or direct user, doesn't matter. If there's a reference user assigned, the subkernel, when the authorization check happens, it will first look at the authorizations from the reference user. And if it fails, so if the authorizations are not in the reference user, it will look at the authorizations from the technical user that the reference user is assigned to. Now, all that happens automatically. You won't see it. It's in the subkernel. And so basically what that means is if we have a rollback here that's missing authorizations, whether it's an entire RFC that we have not authorized, or just an activity or a field value that we have not authorized, it will basically fail here, but then succeed here because the user is still running SAP All. We're not taking SAP All away. What our tool does is basically monitoring that reference use. So it's monitoring what is happening back here, and everything that's missing back here or failing back here, but succeeding here, means the new role is missing certain authorizations. And that's what the tool does instantly. So it's monitoring instantly, and then provides us the log file so we can update those roles and correct them, and then just update and see if it works the next time. So all that can happen in the background. Again, we're not taking SAP all away. It's not impacting the interface, and we can really, in any system, whether it's in production or any other system, we can quote unquote test the new roles. Again, it's not really testing, we're just shadowing, we're monitoring the background, but ultimately it tests the new roles so that over a given time, couple of weeks, couple of months, we get everything tested, we know the authorizations will work, and then we can very safely go live with the new authorizations, where we will take SAP all away and assign the new roles to that RFC user, and we're very, very confident that there will be no issues. So that allows us to, in the background, without even a lot of work, this just works in the background. There's nothing we have to monitor actively. I would only monitor it once a week and make updates and let it run. So it's very, very efficient, very time efficient for me as well to update and get those technical users tested. Now, when we go live, there's still always a little bit of risk, and here's just a log file. I don't want to go into here, but obviously we get a log file that looks an awful lot like ST Austrace, where we get all the return codes. You can see what's missing on what level and so on. Don't want to go into details here. Right, and same here. We can really see what is missing on an object level, field level, value level, to really see what is it that my role misses that we have to add. This is just really a details, just to have it as a screenshot as well. Now, obviously, when we go live, and there's always a little bit of risk when we go live. It could be something that wasn't tested, maybe, or I don't know. It usually doesn't happen. Like if we do it, it very often doesn't happen. But it certainly doesn't happen, because we want to make sure whenever we do those redesigns that it's properly tested. But let's say customer is pushing, or customer is still a little uncertain whether that really works, or doesn't trust it 100% because they hasn't seen it before. Then we still have a fallback scenario also available as part of the XMS. The fallback scenario is basically what we call automatic data role generation, and what that does is it uses the same or similar concept, where we're basically monitoring the technical user. And what that means is, let's say there's an authorization failure, something that wasn't tested, something that now just comes up that wasn't there before or never came up in the past 6 months, whatever the case might be. Let's say we have an authorization failure for whatever reason. The interface performs that authorization check, gets a return code 4 or 8, doesn't work. The interfaces are designed the way, if they have a failed authorization check, they try again within like 2 to 4 seconds. They just try again. What our tool does instantly, that happens within a split second, it basically picks up the failed authorizations, instantly creates a role, adds that authorization that failed into the role, assigns to the user, to the reference user, and then 2 seconds later, the interface tries again. Interface has that authorization passes, the interface continues to run. We get, in the background, we get the email saying, hey, something failed, you got to check. The delta role is automatically generated, it's all there, it will run, it's assigned, so the role exists directly in production. If we activate this in production, this is per user, obviously, where we activate it. And then we can, we can look into it, we can clean it up or correct it, in the roles. This is just a fallback scenario in case something goes wrong. And it's just very often just to kind of mitigate that risk at go live. In case something comes up, we also have a solution for it. Just keep that in mind. And then obviously, and we're also getting short of time. So just to wrap this up, the entire tool that I was showing you is fully built in ABAP. So it's ABAP-based solution. As I said, it's fully certified by SAP. SAP is also one of the customers of the XMS. They use it for in consulting. So if SAP does consulting work for their customers, they use the XMS when it comes to RFC redesigns, simply because we can do it risk-free. It saves you a tremendous amount of time, over manual approaches. Also, from a licensing perspective, we're very flexible. We have project-based licensings where you can just, rent it for 3 or 6 months, however long your project goes. We obviously have perpetual licenses, subscription models. You don't have to rent the entire or buy the entire suite. You can just rent or purchase individual modules. All that is available. Everything, as I mentioned, we're SAP fully certified for S/4HANA, S/4HANA Cloud, to be more specific. That ultimately means everything that we do is in our own table namespace, and everything that we do to SNA4, to PFCG, to anything in the system, always goes through approved, released SAP APIs. So everything we do is 100% SAP standard, 100% SAP compliant. Otherwise, we would not be certified for the cloud. That's very important to mention here. Fully SAP-based standard solution. With that being said, again, when it comes to, and just to wrap it up, when it comes to RFC, it's very important that you think it through, take your time to put a good project plan together when it comes to RFCs. They're a little bit tricky, so it's not as simple because RFCs don't talk back. So you have to figure out a lot of things yourself, not like an end user where you can just ask a question. So for RFC need a little bit of time, especially tracing when it comes to testing. Take the time, don't hurry, because again, they don't talk back. If something doesn't work, business will tell you if a process stops. The RFCs will not call you, so you will feel it one way or the other. That's why it's very important to have a good approach to RFCs. You can do it without disruption to the business process. Just use tools for it. I think we have the tool that allows you to do that, and if you utilize tools, it can be very significant cost reduction, also from a timing perspective. As I mentioned, that entire testing, that all happens in the background. It's a breeze to do it because I can check it at my own pace, own time, once a week for like an hour or so. I check it and make the required changes. Let it run for another week and see what happens next week, and that's how it goes. So the first week I might have a little bit less, a little bit more, but then over time it gets less and less and less. So it's also a very smooth process to get RFC redesigns underway. And obviously you can remediate a lot of audit issues, compliance issues when it comes to GDPR, but also other data protection regulations and IT security in general. I think RFC should be under control. I haven't had the time to show you like a RFC hack. If you will, I'll include in the email. We'll include a session on YouTube, but I'm showing RFC hacking. RFC hacking is a real thing, so that's why it needs to be under control. If you Google RFC hacking, there will be step-by-step instructions how you can hack RFC, and that ultimately comes down to a bad authorization design, bad security. That's why it's so important that we have it under control. I hope that makes sense. With that being said, we have a lot of case studies available as well as success stories from a whole bunch of customers. I mean, I mentioned just 3 here, but there's like another 15 or so available on our homepage when it comes to RFC designs. Even SAP has success stories with the XMS. I think Coop was the customer in Switzerland that SAP did for RFC designs. So also SAP's case study will be available. Just follow the link here and you'll get all the information. If you want to talk to any of the customers for like references, just reach out to us, either to myself or Shelly, and we'll put you in touch with customers so you can talk it through and see what their experience is with RFC hardening projects. We have a few things that you could look at if you're interested. We have an RFC Stock Tool available on our homepage. It's basically a free tool that allows you to scope your entire RFC landscape just to see what's kind of damage and what would be that you have to tackle when you talk RFCs. We obviously have RFC services, redesign services. So if you don't want to do it yourself, you want to hire someone to do it for you, we obviously are the expert in that area. Have a couple of slides and a flyer on the homepage. Just follow the link here, or again, come and talk to me or Shelly, and we're more than happy to help you as well. With that, since we're short of time and I don't see a lot of questions, actually I see no questions, so it looks like I was very efficient in answering them as I went. Just a quick lookout before we end today's session. So next week we have a session about SAP audit. So if you have to deal with SAP audit and you want to automate SAP audit and also talk about certain security monitoring in regards to sub audit. That session will be next week, so just feel free to sign up. Even if you cannot make it, just sign up. You'll get the recording as well. And then we have 3 webinars planned for more specific use cases with the XMS around Fiori, how you can automate and simplify a lot of the Fiori administration with our tools, mass changes, mass updates to Fiori catalogs, groups, spaces, pages, all that we have planned. One webinar specifically about the emergency access management scenarios, firefighter scenarios. We'll show that on June 3rd, and then July 8th we'll talk about how we can mass maintain or simplify the management of organizational structures. So if you have like a lot of derived roles and you want to mass update and you want to have different things around that, we have great tools in that regards as well. That's of interest. Just sign up. As always, you can just sign up. If you cannot make it, you'll get the recording. With that, Shelley, anything else? Or I think we're good. I ran over by 1 minute. I apologize for that.
No, there was a couple questions that came in, but I'm going through and answering some of them, and we can send out something with the. There are a few. Oh,
sorry. I had it hidden. We can maybe spend 2 minutes on it. If anyone wants to stay back to get the questions answered, we'll just quickly go through them. So let's see. Now I have to read them myself first. Or if you can answer any already, Shelley, let me quickly make this a little bit bigger. It's so small.
Somebody asked about the USOBX_C compared to USOBX. I mean, that's the USOBC is the USOBX with your changes to it. So it's the same table. It's just customer specific. Yeah.
USOBX without the C, or like USOBT without the C, that's SU22. So that's SAP's delivered data. That's SU22 data that you can also compare in SU24. So if you go to SU24 and you compare or you add the sub data, that's the data that comes from those USOBX or USOBT table without the _C. That's SU22 data. And whatever you do, whatever PFCG uses, comes from the _C tables, the customer tables, which is SU24.
Several questions around whether these changes are actually done in production or if you start them in dev and transport them through.
When it comes to building roles, obviously in dev, transport them through. For the delta role generation, so where we have that instant creation of access and assign it to the technical user, that would happen directly in production. But everything else would always be obviously following the transport means the change management process that the customer has. Then I see there's a couple of questions in regards to performance. So there's no negative performance, or no negative impact to performance when we use the productive test simulation. Even if you use it for months, it's a low priority job that runs in the background. It again only picks up on the delta that's missing. It's monitoring the buffer. So very performance. It's good on performance. Let's put it that way. It has no negative impact on performance. There was a question in regards to SU24, whether it requires a transport. Yes, SU24 changes, they go on a transport, and sooner or later we want to transport them into production. I always say for 2 reasons. First of all, we want to have all that very used information available in production, so the roles, we can use the very used list. But also, production, when it comes to SU24 data, is the best backup. So if you ever mess it up in dev, it's good to have it in prod. If you didn't back it up before, at least you have a good version in your production system. But obviously, SU24 matters the most where you build your roles, and that's in dev. So it has to be in dev.
One around using the reference user is good, but how do you know the missing values were actually really needed?
That's always a very good question. I mean, there are, and I think we know it more from dialog users, where there's like those we call them kind of those noise authorization checks that we don't necessarily need for the application to function, but they're performed, so a button is shown, or we have the ability to to have like a forward navigation. For RFCs, it's not that much. So there are still a few. We have what we call like a blacklist as well in our tools, where we have certain authorizations blacklisted in the context of function modules that are just not needed, that are like more like the noise stuff that's just happening, but it's not really needed. Other than that, it's also a lot of experience. So that's why when it comes to RFCs, we always want to have very senior people, so that that understand your authorizations and what should be put there, and also what shouldn't. Yep. Anything else?
Do you use the same approach to trace authorizations for users providing authorization to background jobs?
Yes. Very, very similar approach. Same approach at the end of the day. Yeah. So whether it's RFCs or batch users, background users, same approach. Then yeah, there are a couple of comments in regards to footer, that footer shouldn't be used, so we shouldn't authorize to the function group. That's clear. Same, that's very similar to table authorizations. Never use stabo this, use stabo num, or with sprogram, sprog name. The same is true with srfc. We shouldn't use the function group, because then we're opening up all the function modules within that function group. Always better to be the function name, least privilege approach 100%. That's what should be there. Very often the proposals from SAP, if they are there, they come with the function group. That's why it's good to change them. We have tools for that, obviously. Always least privilege approach.
How is SU24 reflected in SU22?
Not at all. When you install the SAP system and you do SU25, the first step is to fill the customer tables, and you do it only once. That's when you set up the system. It's a one-time step. When you fill the customer tables, then you're basically reading SU22, what SAP gives to you, and you update that into SU24. And from that moment forward, all you maintain is SU24. So you're maintaining the customer data. And that's also what's used in PFCG if you build the role. Now, if you go ahead and you have an upgrade, you do an enhancement package upgrade, or whatever you upgrade you do, there might be changes to SU22. So SAP delivers new content in SAP tables, in their tables, which is SU22. Those are the USOBT, USOBX without the _C. That's SU22 data. And that's what you then, in step 2A, to B, to C, to D, when you do SU25, all that can be or has to be compared. That's kind of like that's automatic comparison, but also a lot of manual comparison to ultimately see what SAP is proposing, the changes, and then update if needed into SU25, into SU24, into the customer tables. So the SU22 is SAP data. You cannot change it, or I think you definitely should not change it. I'm not even sure if you can. I never done it because you shouldn't do it. All you do is SU24. That's the data that at the end of the day is used in PFCG. Hope that makes sense.
I think we're pretty good.
Okay. Awesome. If we missed any, we'll follow up, or if, as Shelley mentioned, if there's any that come up later, or you think we forgot or were not answered, or you didn't understand them the way we answered them, just feel free to reach out. I mean, here's my email address. Shelley's is just sjames@exciting.com. You get an email from Sean, from our marketing guy. You can also just respond to his email, and he'll gladly forward it to us, and we'll have it answered for you. With that, thank you very much from my side. Wish you all good rest of your day, and see you in the next one.
Thanks, everybody.